The footage that you are watching is of a father literally torturing his son. This is the utterly harrowing case of Corey Niccolo. Hi guys, thanks for joining me today. Listen, this is a case that I've actually covered on my private channels before today. I wanted to do a deep dive on my main YouTube channel, but I've done this on Patreon and on my YouTube community because it has just really affected me for a million reasons, but for the most part, because I know that all of us agree we would never harm a hair on a child's head. And that's on any child, let alone our own. And when you see children being tortured and abused and killed ultimately by people who are meant to protect them, it just goes against every instinct in a typical human being. Even as an average or sometimes less than average parent, people don't go ahead and harm their children in these incalculably inhumane ways. And yet here we are talking about Christopher Gregor, who did that on every single level, emotional, physical, neglectful, all of these combining to ultimately mean that a beautiful, beautiful little boy, Corey, was murdered. It's going to be a tough one. As you know, we do cover challenging cases here, and the reason for that is we have to talk about child. We have to talk about the fact that children out there suffer, and we have to learn as a community to do more when we see things that to all intents and purposes make us suspect that something pretty heinous could be happening behind closed doors. You know how I always say it, guys? Risk offending. If there's anything we can do to shed light on cases where we can protect children, then we have to absolutely do that. It's a complicated case, this, for lots of reasons. I hope that I do it justice for Corey in particular. So in New Jersey, the case, I suppose, begins because Brianna Niccolo gave birth to Corey. This is when she was 17 years of age. She's really young. I always think there's just such a bravery when young people go ahead with an unplanned pregnancy, because there's a lot of information out there, and this is nothing to do with politics, it's nothing to do with personal belief systems actually. This is just to do with working with young people throughout my career, and when they've got pregnant, often they are offered abortions, and very often that can seem like the easiest choice regarding their future. I'm not saying it is, many people are traumatized by such decisions, but nonetheless, there are options available to young people when they get pregnant that will mean their life doesn't swerve off track. But she doesn't take that choice. She goes ahead and she has the baby. She has Corey. And like I said, I think that's a really courageous decision. Now, the man who got her pregnant, Christopher Gregor, he was 22 when Corey was born. So if you think about 16 and 21, which is essentially when they would have got together, albeit for a short period of time, you can see that there is certainly a power dynamic difference. We've all been 16 and we all know what it's like to do that transition from that age group to 21 years of age. You go from being somebody who's just leaving school to potentially owning a home, maybe even getting married. There's a massive change psychologically and emotionally and just developmentally where you are concerned. So certainly there is going to be a power dynamic that exists there. And also Christopher Gregor is an older guy and he's a big guy. So when you're a petite young 16-year-old girl, he's going to appear stronger, more powerful. And also that can just lend itself to you feeling more controlled in those situations. But in spite of this, she goes ahead, she has a baby, and she's thrilled when Corey is born. And there are so many lovely things that she says as a mother about Corey, but also that the entire wider family talk about regarding who he is. She said he was a really silly child, but there was something quite deep about him. He absolutely adored the solar system. He adored playing outside, and his wider family members said he was really bright. He was hugely energetic, but also he was just this really loving child. And he was somebody who had this joyful spirit, was so full of life, which is at such a juxtaposition to what we're talking about today, because this is a video that talks about him losing his life. His mother, Brianna, she spoke about the fact that he just loved to play, he loved to interact with his surroundings, he was really fond of playing with his toys, engaging in lots of physical activities. He's just gorgeous to look at. And I know that looks don't matter where anyone's concerned, but the reality is when you see a picture of a beautiful child, you can't help further imagining how broken somebody is to want to harm them in any way, shape or form. And those people who talk about Corey said that he was a child with this huge heart. He just loved to show affection. He had a really warm smile, and everybody who met him just adored him. Teachers who knew him said he was a really curious and eager learner. He was really well liked by his peers and also all the teachers that worked with him. He had a real keen interest in his education. And even though there were problems in his personal life because of the things that we're going to cover today, he was somebody that always had this positive presence in school. He had a real love of learning. He loved playing with his peers and getting involved in group activities. So we're talking about someone, yes, at the very beginning of his life, but nonetheless, a life that is full of thriving potential, a life where with those traits, those gifts that I've just talked about would mean he's going to be a pro-social, good human being. And my goodness, the world needs children this way to grow into adults that reflect those traits I've just discussed. Corey could have had it all, but because of his father, because of the egocentricity and selfishness that I'm going to talk about today, all of those activities, such as enjoying physical working out and playing out, were turned into really harmful punishments, torture, I would say. And the fact that we're talking about this beautiful little boy whose tragic end happened on the 2nd of April 2021 when he was literally 5 years old is harrowing beyond belief. So let's talk about Christopher Gregor, who's the perpetrator in this case, because Christopher Gregor is one of those people that, to all intents and purposes, had it all. He comes from a good family. He's had all the trappings of a good life with parents who really loved him. Opportunities. He's been popular. He was a former high school football star at Monroe Township High School. He was also an honor student. So this is a guy with a lot of potential. And when you look at what he's done after leaving school, he was somebody who worked as a realtor and also a maths teacher. He'd actually volunteered at a mental health hotline, and that was a crisis line that was basically there to help people who were struggling. He did that for 6 months in 2015. And when you look at his parenting, he had good parents who brought him up well. In fact, his dad, from what I can find out in the research, is that he was a highly decorated New Jersey State Trooper. So he has everything to play for, everything. But what's really strange, I suppose, about this case is that Gregor didn't actually know Corey for a very long time. In fact, the first time he actually met him was barely a year before he actually abused him to death. Because when Brianna got pregnant, he wasn't informed about that. Now, a lot of people will have judgment calls on that and say, well, he should have been aware. If he's fathered a child, she should have had the decency to actually inform him that that was the case. But equally, maybe she had misgivings about this man. Maybe she didn't want to have him involved in her life at all. Maybe there were issues in the relationship that led to her believing that he was not going to be a positive influence in Corey's life. And my God, if that is how she felt about it, well, that's for good reason, because we wouldn't be talking about this case today if he had been the kind of person you'd want around a child. So ultimately, whilst we would ideally want a child to be aware of their father, also, if you're scared about who that human being is who's fathered your child, you may want to keep them at arm's length for very good reason. Now, like I said, when he was at school, he was really successful. He was an honor student, as I noted. He was an all-state defensive lineman who played for the school's 2009 Group 3 state championship football team. And that very same year, in 2009, he was actually selected to be part of the district's Heroes and Cool Kids mentorship program. And this was for middle schoolers. And that particular program was reserved for high school students who were considered really positive role models. So he was standing out for all the right reasons at that time. He was somebody, like I said, who had everything around him shaping up to give him a great future. And that means that when we look at nature nurture, we're talking potentially about a man who had everything at his fingertips, but just has a thread of badness running through him. Genetics are an interesting thing. You know, you can have the greatest parents in the world and still end up a killer. You can have people who love you and support you and still become a child murderer. It's rarer than when you are born to people who are problematic, but it certainly happens. He actually was reported to live at a sprawling New Jersey estate, which was valued at over $1 million. So obviously, economically, he was in a very good place. But it feels like that thread, as I said, of badness that was running through his veins had got him into hot water on several occasions. He'd had run-ins with the law across different states, and these included offences in Connecticut and Maryland, where he'd actually racked up half a dozen criminal charges between August 2017 and April 2018. And those charges, they were no small charges. They included assault, robbery, and destruction of property. So there is violence within him. You know, there is an individual here that we're talking about who likes to use force if he isn't getting his own way. And when you think about the archetypal bully, the bulldozer of a human being, I genuinely think that Gregor fits this. I think he's one of those people, he wants to get his way, and if he isn't going to get his way, he's going to knock you down to assume that he gets it. So that's the way that he works. Now, as I've said, he only came into Corey's life when he was 5 years old, and the reason for that is he petitioned the court for joint custody. Until this point, Brianna was basically looking after her little boy, but she did have some issues with addiction, she'd struggled with sobriety, and financially she needed some support. So the grandmother of Corey actually got in contact with him and said that they needed some kind of financial assistance. And I imagine that was a big shock to Christopher Gregor to realise that they actually had a child together. But he decides that he actually wants to be involved in his son's life. And to all intents and purposes, that's an excellent thing. You would want a father, albeit a father who's not been involved because he didn't know that the child existed, to become a present and positive force in their life. But of course, that isn't why he's petitioning, in my mind, for shared custody. I would believe that the reason he's doing it is because he likes to be in control. And he wants Brianna to realise that she has something that belongs to him, and he is going to be somebody who makes sure that he gets what belongs to him. And you see, if you have a territorial mindset, if you're an individual who believes that people are objects, and therefore if you own part of that object, you are going to absolutely state your claim in it, then you will act in this way. And I suppose from the outside looking in, people will also think to themselves, oh, this is the right thing for him to do. Shared custody is really positive for children psychologically in the good conditions that most of them will entertain it. But that's likely not the reason why he went for custody. Now, like I said, he has a wider family group, his mother and father. They are clearly loving people in Corey's life, and I genuinely believe that they had Corey's best interests at heart. So I'm going to absolutely focus on Gregor being the problem in this situation and not his parents, who also had access to Corey. But it must have been a huge shock for Brianna. First of all, she doesn't tell him about this child. Then gets to a point ultimately where she needs some financial assistance, so he's told about this child. Then she's dealing with a situation where she's literally fighting for custody of her boy. Now, allegedly, on Gregor and Corey's first meeting, Corey returns home with a busted lip. Now, I get it. There are a lot of people out there who'll be saying, well, you know, these things happen. We've had kids where they've got into accidents and there's been no malevolence involved. But the fact is that Brianna doesn't believe Gregor's excuse. So automatically, she's fearing that there is something bigger to the story. So he says that he'd accidentally kicked Corey while they were playing soccer. And this is a plausible explanation, and a DCPP caseworker does accept the explanation, doesn't go and investigate any further. But remember, this is a guy who's going to come across very well, he's clever, he's well presented, comes from a good home. So the actual worker is probably thinking, well, you know, busted lip, no big deal. But Brianna just senses. She has an instinct, an intuition, and bear in mind she's got a history with him. And she doesn't believe his story, and she must have been absolutely terrified that there is something darker and deeper going on. And Brianna, from the get-go, is really worried about Gregor's behaviour towards Corey. She said that from the first meeting onwards, Corey was routinely abused by Gregor. And one of the things that she felt that Gregor was using to punish her beautiful boy was a treadmill. And she actually said that she was so concerned about this that she reported Gregor to the New Jersey Division of Child Protection and Permanency. And she did that, guys, over 100 times. And that's 100 times in a span of 18 months. And that was beginning in 2019. And you know how much action was taken from those 100 times that she actually reported him? None. Now, what I have seen happen in cases like this, where a parent is repeatedly asking for help, repeatedly saying, look, there is a problem here, and they constantly report, they sometimes get looked at suspiciously. Oh, this is about parental alienation. You don't like having this man involved in your child's life. You want him to disappear from your child's life. You don't want him aside from the money. And they can actually get seen as the problematic person in the relationship, as opposed to the mother who's brought this child up for years, who loves this child, who has their best interests at heart and knows something bad is happening. And bear in mind, Corey has a very close relationship with his mother. He's going to be speaking the words to her. He's going to be saying to her, this is how it happened. So she will be believing her son as well. Now, on the 1st of April 2021, Brianna Michelow is really concerned about what's happening to Corey, and she takes him to his pediatrician and also to 2 different medical centres because she fully believes that Gregor is abusing their son. And Corey actually tells the pediatrician that Gregor had made him run on the treadmill really fast because he was mad, and that his father had told him that he was too fat. Now, if you look at Corey in the pictures, you can clearly see he is not fat in any way, shape or form. But as a parent, if you're punishing a child this way, both physically and emotionally, you're abusing them on 2 levels there. You should not be within 1,000 feet of that child. You are toxic. And it also speaks to the mindset of Gregor. Gregor is a control freak. It's very, very clear. Apparently, he was somebody who got very obsessed with weight, and he's projecting this onto his child. And like I said, you take one look at this beautiful little boy and you can tell there is nothing fat about him whatsoever. But also, even if he was a child who was carrying weight, you would not handle this situation this way because it solves nothing. No child suddenly loses weight unless it's catastrophic because they felt so bullied that they get an eating disorder by this kind of method. Children lose weight when you give them positive role models, you give them a good diet, you make exercise fun, and you don't make them feel ashamed of who they are. But Gregor doesn't get that memo because it's all about Gregor. He's egocentric, he's completely obsessed with what he wants, and he has absolutely no room emotionally for this child. Now, the physicians who examined Corey found absolutely nothing wrong with him at this point, and that's really important for what happens down the line. They did find some bruising on his body, but again, that would be contextual with childhood. Children often get bruised. Now, Michelow was so concerned about what was happening to Corey that she'd actually filed an order to show cause for emergency custody of her son. But frustratingly, this was actually rejected on the 1st of April. And the reason that is so frustrating is because if that had happened, then we would not be talking about this today. Because Brianna can see something potentially catastrophic is going to occur, and she is 100% right. But even though this cause for emergency custody had been put in, they apparently found that Corey was not in danger of imminent and irreparable harm, which is ludicrous because, like I said, I'm talking about this today because he 100% was. So because she isn't given this emergency protective order, essentially, it meant that on the morning of the 2nd of April 2021, about 9 a.m, she has to drop Corey off at Gregor's house. And that was going to be the last time that she was ever going to see her gorgeous little boy alive. In the afternoon, around 3:30 p.m, Gregor actually tells Brianna that he's taking Corey to the hospital. Doesn't actually tell her which one. She doesn't inform her of where he's taking her child. And that's a power and control thing. The first thing out of your mouth, if you're dealing with a child who is unwell and you're speaking to a parent to inform them of this, you're going to tell them exactly where you're going because you're going to know, irrespective of your relationship, irrespective of the issues you have with each other, that your child is going to want the parent with them, the loved mother in this scenario. But he doesn't do that because it's all about power for him, isn't it? So Corey at this point is taken by his father to Southern Ocean Medical Center, and it's just devastating because at this point Corey is limp and he's carried into the hospital by his dad. So this is how seriously unwell he is. Gregor then tells the medical staff that Corey had woken up from a nap. He was stumbling apparently, he was slurring his words. Also, he said he was experiencing nausea and shortness of breath. Now, they are very serious issues for a child to be experiencing, and there's going to be a prelude to those issues. Bear in mind, his mother, Brianna, has had him at the doctors very, very recently, and they have said that he has got a fit bill of health. There are no issues apart from a few bruises. And now we're dealing with a child who is very desperately ill. Now, shortly after arriving at the hospital, as they start to deal with Corey, he starts to suffer seizures. This is actually when he's being taken in for a CT scan. And surveillance footage actually captures nurses and a doctor comforting Gregor because apparently he then collapses in a chair outside his son's hospital room. And during this period, Corey actually coded twice. And they did try their best. They did all the life-saving measures that they could put into practice, but it was unsuccessful. So 2 hours after he arrives at the hospital, he passes away. Now, apparently on hearing the news that his child, this child that he's meant to love, this child that he's meant to protect, this child that he's wanted in his life, that's why he's petitioned for custody, when he realizes that he's died, this is within 20 minutes of finding out that he's lost his son, he leaves the hospital, gets into his car, and drives out of the state. Now, I get it. People will say, well, that's shock for you. And I would say that's BS. The last thing you're going to want to do when your baby, and I use that word to broach every age of us having children. It doesn't matter whether your kid is 3 or 30, they're your baby. The last place you're going to be when they've died is in a car driving out of state. It just doesn't resonate. First of all, you're not going to be in a situation where you're safe to drive because you are going to feel broken into a million pieces and you're not going to be able to function. Also, the only place you're going to want to be is next to them. This is the last opportunity that you're ever going to have with your baby. So you are not going to leave that hospital unless there is something very strange going on in your psyche or if you know damn straight why they've died. And bear in mind, Corey didn't get to see his mother because she wasn't told which hospital he was going to. The very fact that he's denied Brianna this opportunity to be present whilst her son takes his last breaths is just unfathomably cruel. On April the 3rd, they do an autopsy on Corey's body and they find straight away there was really intensive bruising to his body. And the cause of death was found to be blunt force injuries with cardiac and liver contusions with acute inflammation and sepsis. Now, the person who carried out the autopsy, the doctor who was involved, they didn't actually rule on the manner of death. So Corey's death was originally ruled as undetermined because clearly they couldn't absolutely pinpoint how it had happened, and people do die accidentally and they need to investigate to make sure that they understand exactly what played out to bring him to this position. Now, 2 days after Corey's death, his dad, Gregor, was actually pulled over by police in Elko, Tennessee for speeding in a constriction zone. So bear this in mind. This guy has just been off somewhere else at a time where you would imagine that the least he'd want would be to be surrounded by family. His little boy's dead. Now, one officer noted in body cam footage that he was basically shaking like a leaf. Yeah, I wonder why. Probably because he knows what's coming next, because he's guilty as hell. Gregor, of course, at this point denied trying to cross the border. He said that he'd turned around in Arkansas and was basically heading home. He said he'd been driving for 20 hours and had made it somewhere near the Arkansas-Texas state line before turning around and then traveling another 5 hours to Nashville. But I wouldn't buy into this because this guy is a consummate liar. It's as simple as that. He also made comments about his son Corey, and one of the things he said was if he didn't have a drug-addicted mother, then he'd still be alive. So instantly projecting blame onto Brianna that she's the problem, that she's the reason that his son is dead, as opposed to he's been abusing him, and that's led to what we're talking about right now. He goes on to tell the police that he believes that Brianna's linked to Corey's death. He said, When he got home, I knew something was wrong in my gut. He also referred to her as a, quote, special kind of dirtbag. He's basically immediately trying to sidestep any guilt himself and project onto her by making out that she's some kind of terrible parent who's drug-addled, doesn't take care of her son, and essentially is the reason why he's been driving around all this time, because he's so devastated by what's happened. But again, it doesn't make sense on a psychological level. And if that were the case, if you really did believe that she was guilty, you would be by the side of your child, even when they passed, because you would know you did nothing wrong and you'd 100% want her to be in trouble for causing whatever has led to this child's death. But basically, he then goes on to say that she and her family had previously planted marijuana on him and that he'd actually been arrested in New Jersey because of this. So again, very much trying to paint her as the person who's going to be responsible for the death of this child, not taking any responsibility or any accountability for his own actions, and essentially probably hoping at this moment in time that he's going to be believed. And I would say as well that one of the things about this guy's mindset is he concocts a story and wants to believe and buy into that story himself. He's somebody who likely understands the way that he's treated his son is completely inappropriate, but is good at sidestepping that and instead forming this identity with, well, he's a boy. He needs to understand that life can be difficult as a boy. He needs to grow up and realize that he's got to be tough. You know, we hear that abusers use this kind of language when they talk to themselves about their actions. And I genuinely think that Christopher Gregor is one of these. When he's acting horrendously towards his child, when he's venting to his child, when he's taking out his anger and frustration on his child, he's believing that somehow he's building him into a man. And that's the excuse he uses, which is why it's really easy to project all the negativity onto Brianna, the mother in this case. Now, on the 7th of July 2021, Christopher Gregor is originally charged with child endangerment, and this is in relation to a surveillance video that is now infamous that was found by the people who were investigating Corey's death. Now, this video actually shows Gregor increasing the speed and the incline on the treadmill, and Corey falls 6 times. Just imagine the speed that that's going. And one of the really heartbreaking things about this is that you see Corey kind of getting up and getting on it again. He doesn't even necessarily need to be commanded to do so, because clearly he's scared of a man that he should be feeling most protected by. And so they have this evidence now that Corey has been treated in a torturous manner by the man who's meant to protect him. Now, in September 2021, a consulting forensic pathologist reviewed the case, and the manner of death for Corey was determined to be homicide. And it was homicide that was stemming from chronic abuse. So completely in line with what Brianna had been telling Child Protective Services since the get-go, since day one of him having access to Corey. She's been screaming about this. She's been sounding the alarm, and everyone has been ignoring her. So this examiner believed that Corey suffered an acute traumatic injury to the heart 4 to 12 hours before his death. And he found evidence of chronic abuse, including blunt impact injuries of the chest and abdomen with laceration of the heart, left pulmonary contusion, laceration and contusion of the liver. So really, really serious injuries and unsurvivable in this case. Now, it wasn't until almost a year after Corey's death, this is on the 9th of March 2022, that Christopher Gregor was actually arrested for Corey's murder. So he's just been carrying on with his life. And I would not say, from what I understand from the research I've done, that he was having a bad time. He wasn't grieving. His life hadn't ended when Corey's did. And you see, that's something that's really testament to me about the difference between him and Brianna. Brianna has been absolutely broken as the mother in this case, whereas Christopher Gregor has kind of just got on with his life full stop. And that's a mark of somebody who's not empathic. It's a mark of somebody who did not care about this beautiful little boy. Now, the charge of murder is because they said Gregor knowingly caused serious bodily injury resulting in the death of another. So essentially, Gregor was charged in 2 separate incidents, each having different charges associated with them. So the treadmill incident, that resulted in a charge of child endangerment that occurred on March the 20th, 2021. And then on April the 2nd, 2021, Corey died of blunt force trauma, and that meant that that was separate, so no treadmill was involved. So the charge of murder is that Gregor knowingly caused serious bodily injury resulting in the death of another. So even though he had whole freedom for a year, now he was dealing essentially with a very, very serious charge of murder. After he was arrested, he was held without bond at the Ocean County Jail. And the reason for that is that they felt that he was a significant risk to the community, particularly given the nature of his actions towards his son. Also, without doubt, he was considered a flight risk. Now, this is interesting. When he was arrested, he was told, if you plead guilty, we'll offer you a plea deal. So before the trial, he was offered the opportunity to essentially say he was guilty and he'd get a 30-year sentence. But he rejected this. Instead, he went to trial. Now, it's a gamble because if you reject the plea deal, there's a possibility of a harsher sentence. But this, in my opinion, psychologically also reflects that he's continuing to deny the responsibility for his son's death. And I genuinely think he's one of those individuals psychologically who's kind of a gambling man. He's willing to take the risk because he thinks to himself that there is a chance he won't have to spend 30 years in prison. And it will be very unpalatable to an individual who enjoys his freedom and, let's be clear, probably doesn't think that what he did was really wrong in the first place. He's not going to want to give up 30 years of his life. And I genuinely feel throughout this trial, he doesn't think he's guilty. In his head, he's convinced himself that somehow it's all Brianna's fault and that he is somehow a victim. We see this time and time again in these scenarios, even when the banks arise, even when it's clear that the evidence points in their direction, even when they have video footage of them actually doing a certain crime, in their mind, because they have made it okay in their head, they think that somehow other people are going to be okay with it as well. So when it gets to trial, the prosecution basically alleged that Gregor was 100% responsible for Corey's death and that he had been repeatedly abusing the 6-year-old. Now, in the defense's opening statement, I would say that it is intriguing the way that he goes because I think it's destabilizing for Gregor from the get-go. And I'm glad because there is nothing more wonderful than watching somebody who is entirely guilty basically be failed by their defense. So in the opening statements, the defense counsel says that Gregor had only just found out about Corey when he was sued for child support. He said he didn't know he was a father before that. He said he only became aware of his son's existence when Corey's maternal grandmother had rang asking for support for the child. He went ahead, had a paternity test, and indeed he found out that Corey was his son. At this point, Gregor and his parents actually got custody of Corey. They said that the reason that Brianna lost custody for a time was because of the drug addiction, but equally, what he's painting here is a picture of a family who are stepping in at a time when Corey needed them. And we can understand that's powerful because you're trying to paint a picture of this responsible party and the wider family as responsible parties to make sense of, well, look at him. There is no way this guy who's gone out of his way to win custody of this child would kill him a year later. So he's going down this line of, you think he's a bad guy, but just look at what he did, making sure this child was safe from his drug-addled mother. Now, of course, the real thorn in the side for the defense is that surveillance footage from this beautiful little boy on the treadmill, clearly being tortured on it. Now, prosecutor Christine Lento tells the jurors, everything that you need and want, everything you need to know is captured on this video. And the defense know, of course, that this is a big problem. So, as I said, what I think destabilizes from the get-go is what this particular lawyer who's defending him says in the opening statements. So he says, you're not going to like him, and I don't care you don't like him. You'll be horrified and mortified. Just going to throw it out there. Just going to throw it out there. Your job as a defense counsel is not to maximize. Your job as a defense counsel is to minimize. And if you're going to stand as a defense counsel and basically say, yeah, this guy's a douchebag. Yeah, you're not going to like him when you see this video of him torturing his child. Yeah, I probably don't like him too, basically. That is not going to look good for any jury. I am surprised that the defense didn't just come in with this guy was making his son run because he wants to teach him to be a man, and he's misguided and he's foolish, but he didn't have an intention to harm his child. He thought he was doing what was right for his child, but instead he very much goes down the line of, yeah, he's coming across as an abusive bully. And when you have a defense counsel doing that, I genuinely think it's going to be hard for the jury to hear anything positive that you say about that particular individual down the line. And after he's kind of come out with all of this, he then says the evidence that you're going to see of Corey's death had nothing to do with that treadmill. But there's an interesting thing psychologically. And after bringing this treadmill into sharp focus, he then says, listen, the evidence you will see of Corey's death has nothing to do with it. Which again, I think is problematic because all the jury are doing at that moment in time is focusing on the treadmill. Now that surveillance footage that was taken at the fitness centre at Gregor's apartment and is shown at trial, it demonstrates Corey running on the treadmill as his dad is increasing the speed. And in that horrendous video, he's stumbling, he's falling multiple times, he's desperately trying to keep up, and Gregor can literally be seen grabbing Corey by the shirt. At one point, it almost looks like he's gone over and bitten Corey's head. And when they bring in Corey's mother, Brianna, she says he was obsessed with weight. He was constantly making Corey feel concerned about being fat. And throughout the trial, this video constantly crops up with Christine Lento, who's the Ocean County prosecutor, saying, what kind of a father would do this to their son? And she notes in the video, Gregor's increasing the incline on the machine. But the defense, of course, come in and say, no, you're wrong. The reality is that Corey was operating that treadmill all by himself. He kept getting up on the treadmill again and again. So he's suggesting that this 6-year-old is like, oh, I'm really enjoying falling and hitting myself repeatedly in a dangerous way. I'm just getting up because I'm having the greatest time of my life, said no 6-year-old ever. But this is what the defense is trying to get across. Look, the child of his own volition is getting up and running on this treadmill. He also said that Corey wasn't bitten by his dad. Apparently there's no physical evidence that he did. But again, you can bite somebody and not leave marks. And with respect, people who are very frustrated and immature emotionally, biting is something that we see. Now, the prosecution countered and said, listen, you're right. He did get up. He did get back on that treadmill. And he did it many times. And the reason for that is he was terrified of his father. This wasn't a child enjoying himself. This wasn't a child who was getting up because he had an intention to beat his next best time on the treadmill. This is a child who knows that the alternative is even more scary. Now, the incident didn't kill Corey, but what the prosecution argued was that Gregor's overall cycle of abuse ultimately led to his son's death. The defense and the prosecution, they ended up having these different explanations as to why Gregor left the hospital so shortly after Corey's death. His defense came out with the most ludicrous defense ever. And genuinely, the explanation of the defense just sounds stupid. They said he was grieving. He wanted to be alone. I mean, I don't know about you, but your child's just died. Your child's body isn't even cold. And you are so consumed by your own feelings for yourself that you leave to have time alone. Said no authentic parent ever. But that was what he was apparently doing. He was grieving and wanted to be alone. Prosecutors, of course, seized the opportunity to say no. He knew what he'd done and he was trying to flee. Now, a nurse who was called to give testimony in court said that when Corey was brought into hospital and they helped bring Corey in, they said that they really struggled because she was also with him when Corey died. And she said, we were the only ones with him. So Gregor wasn't with him when he died. She also said that Gregor was really emotionless when he brought Corey in, that he did occasionally come and see what was happening, but then he just left and walked out again. So there was no consistency there. Now, Corey's mother was called as a witness in court. And of course, this is a woman who was denied being present with her son when he took his last breath. I mean, that in itself is just utterly heinous. And she talked about how, indeed, Gregor had not met his son until a year before his death. But that whenever Corey came home, it was routinely covered in bruises and cuts. She also talked about in court the fact that about 5 months after Corey's death, she did indeed vandalise his parents' home. She threw dead fish, ham hocks and goose egg stones at it. But I have total sympathy and empathy. Genuinely. I know it's not something that I should say, but if somebody killed my child, that's the very least I would want to do. In fact, I genuinely think that she shows incredible restraint. I don't think I'd be throwing ham hocks at the house. I do seriously think I'd want to do some very, very severe damage. Now, during the trial, Christopher Gregor's parents, David and Carol Gregor, took to the stand to give their testimony, basically on the moment that they found out that their grandson had died. Now, understandably, we are not holding them to account. They certainly loved Corey, even though they'd only known him a year. It's very clear when you hear them talking that they had a relationship with him and that they thought the world of him and that they wanted a good relationship with him. But unfortunately, they had also birthed a monster, shall we say. And it's not okay that people were threatening them. And I'm sure that Brianna's family probably did do things that are regretful, but they did them because they lost a child that they loved. And they were probably completely blindsided by it. And you don't always act ultimately like the best person in the world when something truly tragic has happened to your life and you feel blameful towards other people and other parties. Now, during the testimony, his mother Carol, she just broke down. And she actually described a phone call that she received from Gregor at the hospital. She said that she was beside herself. She talked about the fact that Gregor was hysterical, that he was screaming, that he was saying, what did she do to him? Of course, this is in reference to the blame that he has for Brianna, Corey's mother. And she's choking back tears in court. She described the moment that she was informed that she'd lost her grandson, essentially. She said that she started to call her husband, that she was flipping out of the house. She was hysterically screaming after being told the news. And this is a time in court where Gregor actually looked like he had an emotional bone within his body. It's the only one, I believe, genuinely. And I think that's to do with the fact that ultimately he's watching his mother get upset and that triggers him in a different way to any other circumstance in court, probably because there is that fundamental reality that she has been affected by his actions and ultimately there is nothing that he can do about that. She's facing the kind of things that he's done full on in court. And even though I genuinely believe this man has an issue with empathy and is incredibly egocentric, I think that we all have a sticking point, an emotional breaking point. For him, watching his mother get upset, that affects him. And it affects him differently to the rest of the case. It genuinely does. He's wiping tears with a handkerchief. He's getting visibly upset. She also said, I was so worried. And she said he was so adamant that something had happened when Corey was with his mother. And she also testified that her younger son, Danny, had received threatening phone calls on the home phone as she was driving to the hospital. I'm assuming, like I said, that that was from Brianna's family. Now, something that cropped up in court was that one of the things that Gregor did whilst he was in jail is he called his mother and tried to tell her what to say. Now, in that phone call, Gregor's mum was not receptive at all to his coaching, and his dad actually came onto the phone and said, just back up, just stop. And before she actually ended the call, she said, this is the end of the call, it's over, stop, stop, stop. So again, Gregor's parents are doing the right thing, but how manipulative? He's calling his mother from prison, trying to get her to stick to a story. And that phone call was actually revealed in court, and it prompted Gregor's defence to abandon their questioning of Carol, so they didn't carry it on. And the defence actually urged the judge not to throw out the entire testimony of Gregor's parents. They said, listen, she made every attempt to stop him from talking. He was the one who persisted. She hung up on her son because he continued to persist. And I think that's important because clearly both of his parents were not willing to participate in what he was suggesting, and they made it very clear that it was not acceptable for him to be asking them. So their testimony, I agree, shouldn't be completely thrown out. Now, throughout the trial, Gregor's legal team constantly said it wasn't abuse that killed Corey. He died of an infection. Now, bear in mind, this is again strange because he had been seen by a doctor the day before he ultimately passed away. So why on earth they went down the road of this was just an unfortunate infection? It makes little sense. But defense attorney Mario Galucci said that he died of natural causes. Let's be real. 6-year-olds don't die of natural causes very often, particularly not so quickly, not in the Western world. It's as simple as that. It's very rare, thank God, for children to die. But this is the way the defense is going. They said actually it was a rapidly spreading infection and basically he came down with pneumonia and that's what killed him. Now, these allegations are completely disputed by the testimony of medical professionals, and there were a lot of them. So forensic pathologist Dr. Thomas Andrews said that Corey died from blunt impact injury of the chest and abdomen with a laceration of the heart, also beginning with a contusion below Corey's diaphragm. He said that he suffered 2 significant injuries to his liver, including a laceration to the liver tissue that causes blood to pool on his pelvis. Andrew testified that Corey's body was also found to have pulmonary contusion to his lung, causing internal bleeding, and also several scalp contusions. Notably, Corey also suffered a fatal laceration near the tip of his heart. And Andrew also said this was exacerbated by chronic ongoing stress in his life. He said the immediate cause of death was blunt force injuries on the day he died, but stress, cardiomyopathy, suggests that there was ongoing physiological stress, most likely due to mistreatment or abuse. So just think about what he's saying there. He's saying, yeah, this child died at the final blow of this blunt force injury, but the contributing stress that he was suffering regularly contributed to his death. And when we study in psychology stress, coping and diseases, because there is such an interplay between them, some of you listening to this now, you'll have gone through stressful periods and got sick. Some of you will know people who have lost people they love and they will have died, as we say, of a broken heart. And it's true. Stress exacerbates illness on every single level. It's horrific. It inflames our immune systems. It sets us on fire emotionally and physically, and it can kill us. But we're talking about a 6-year-old child who was so persistently stressed that eventually, along with these injuries, it made his body give up. And of course, that same pathologist said the manner of death was homicide, not infection. Now, during this testimony of this doctor, Gregor just basically looks at the doctor in this glaring manner. It's very strange. It's almost combative some of the time. He does appear occasionally emotional, as the injuries particularly described, but then he goes back into this kind of quite withdrawn state. Now, another doctor, somebody called Anat Feingold, they were hired to review the medical records. He said there was no evidence at all that Corey had suffered from an infection before his death. He said, my conclusion was there was no evidence that Corey had an infectious disease at any point, and certainly that was not the cause of his death. The prosecutor asserted Corey did not die of an infection. He said it's not pneumonia. The defendant lacerated Corey's heart, lacerated his liver, and Corey's lungs were bruised. This is why Corey died. So the tests and the examinations that were performed on Corey by the doctors the day before his death, they all provided the evidence that Corey's fatal injuries were not suffered until he was in his father's custody. Now, Dr. Yi Noor-Ung, he was somebody who evaluated Corey the night of April 1st, 2021. He testified that aside from the bruising and some scratches, which vary by degree and age, Corey had appeared to be in completely good health. And this is why he was discharged from Jersey Shore University Medical Center just after midnight on April 2nd, 2021, with no signs whatsoever of infection or sepsis. Now, Gregor's defense quizzed Ung on whether he followed the proper procedures in discharging Corey and releasing him to his mother in the early morning hours, so around 1 a.m. of the 4th of the 2nd, 2021. Ung insisted that Corey's blood work and all the other diagnostic tests came back within the normal range and that discharge with instructions to follow up with a child abuse specialist was the appropriate step. So again, somebody who's followed all this protocol clarified that there was nothing wrong with Corey and sent him home. There in court stating it was not an infection because I would have seen it when his mother brought him in. It was not there, end of. Also, William Doyle, who was an individual who worked as a triage nurse at Southern Ocean Medical Center, They described seeing Gregor bring Corey to the emergency room on April the 2nd, and Doyle described Gregor as having a clinical effect and just didn't seem upset, which is really strange when you put into full focus what we're talking about, that this beautiful little boy was fatally unwell, in fact, and yet his father just wasn't reacting. In his trial, bizarrely, Gregor did not testify in his defence. That is quite shocking, because this is an individual who's taught, it's an individual who's been a mentor, it's an individual who's been very popular at his high school. You would imagine that he has social skills and he has communication skills. And of course, if there's nothing to hide, you'd want to be on the stand. If you are somebody who's authentic, you're knowing you're innocent, you believe in your own story, then you are going to get on that stand and you're going to be willing to be put under cross-examination by the prosecution. But he didn't. And apparently it drew audible gasps from the people who were watching in the courtroom. Everyone was blindsided. Why would he not want to give evidence? Why would he not want his day in court where he can say, how dare you accuse me of this? I know for a fact I did not kill my son. And by the way, I believe that Brianna, the mother in this case, is the responsible party. The fact that he didn't do that, it's shocking. Now, in their closing statement, prosecutors claim that Gregor inflicted blunt force trauma on the little boy because his mother returned him to Gregor's house 14 hours late. So basically, he was punishing Corey because Brianna brought him back late. And he doesn't like people having power over him. Now we understand why she brought him back late. She wanted emergency protection for her son. She didn't want him to go back to Gregor. She was terrified of what was going to happen, and rightly so. And the fact that she takes him home late gives him license to take all of that frustration and anger and lack of control and loss of control in those 14 hours out on Corey. He's punishing her through Corey. He can't control her, but he can control her child. That's what's so abominable about this. Corey's the punching bag because Brianna can't be one for him now. Now, the trial itself lasted a month and nearly 2 days of juror deliberations took place before they returned their verdict. The jury rejected a murder charge, but 31-year-old Christopher Gregor was found guilty of aggravated manslaughter and endangering the welfare of a child. Gregor stared at the ground. He could actually be seen shaking his head slightly. Corey's mother, Brianna, just broke down in court as the verdict was given because she had been waiting ultimately for that to happen. She wanted to know that somebody was going to be held accountable for taking this beautiful boy of hers away from her. When it came down to the victim impact statements, they were powerful. You can see that the family were just devastated and also enraged by the fact that Corey's been stolen from them. His grandma said, "I will not stand here and tell you that I forgive this monster, because I don't, and I will never. You'll never hear those words come out of my mouth. The actions of this man have greatly affected my life, the lives of my 2 daughters, my 2 sons, my granddaughter, and 19,000 others from around the world, including teachers and doctors." On April the 2nd, 2021, this man lost control and he beat my grandson and he denied him medical attention for several hours, only taking him to hospital by car when Corey was within an hour of death and leaving him to die with only a nurse and hospital staff around him, denying my daughter and myself to be with Corey, denying Corey the comfort of having people who loved him with him as he took his last breath. This is not a man who should be shown mercy. Brianna Michelow, clearly the person who's lost most in this case, she said to the judge, "I stand here before you to plead for justice that Corey rightfully deserves and to press for the maximum sentence of Christopher Gregor." She said, at 16, I first met the defendant who was 21. He gave me drugs and alcohol and he took complete advantage of me. She also spoke about the shame that she felt from her past. She said, "I would like to speak about my past, which I'm not 100% proud of. You've heard a lot about it throughout the trial, and so did a lot of the world. It was really upsetting for that to come out because I worked extremely hard for many years to be where I am today. I admit I did abuse drugs, but I stand before you today clean and sober, and I know Corey would be so proud of me." Unfortunately, my son is no longer here to tell his story. So I'm here to be his voice and tell his story, along with all the others sitting in the gallery who have continued to stand by me. Not once have you seen the defendant cry here for Corey in the last 3.5 years since he killed him. And today was fake. I don't believe it. I don't accept any apologies. He has no remorse for any of his actions. I would never wish this feeling or how I must now live on my worst enemy. In spite of everything he did, Corey still loved him and looked up to him. He still wanted him to have a real father who treated him like a son. She said, "I will never forgive you. You have stolen my full potential of happiness and I will never have my son back. My family will never feel whole again. My daughter will never get to meet her brother and my boyfriend will never get to be the father that Corey deserved." After he was found guilty, the family were pictured outside the courtroom. Corey's mother and family members were just hugging each other, and also the prosecutors who tried the case because they had come through for them. And Brianna said, "We're so happy with the verdict." She thanked the prosecutors and she said, "He deserves to be in jail. He's a very bad man." She's actually also sued New Jersey Division of Child Protection and Permanency for failing to protect Corey properly. And she actually says in her civil suit that her son Corey might still be alive had the agency and its caseworkers adequately, properly and fully investigated the reports of abuse that she made concerning the son and his father. She's accused the agency of being negligent and reckless and is seeking both wrongful death and survivor damages because clearly she's lost her son and she has to carry on. Now, when it came down to the sentencing, aggravated manslaughter carries anything between 5 and 30 years. And so the family were incredibly relieved when he was given 25 years. Of course, his defense attorney has said that his client's not surprised by the verdict, but it was just a very first step in a very long battle and that he's absolutely going to appeal the jury's verdict. But with respect, the chances of him getting out any earlier, I would say, are minimal. I would be very surprised, however, if he just have his sentence reduced. Equally, the prosecutor released a statement saying, "At long last, justice for Corey has been accomplished. Christopher Gregor must live the rest of his life with the knowledge that he, and he alone, was responsible for the death of his one and only son." Whilst nothing can bring this precious child back to his family, we hope that today's jury verdict offers some semblance of peace and closure for those who knew and loved Corey. So Christopher Gregor has been sentenced to 25 years in prison for the aggravated manslaughter of his 6-year-old son, Corey. That sentencing took place in August 2024. Superior Court Judge Guy P. Ryan made significant remarks about the severity of Gregor's actions, particularly highlighting the incident where Gregor forced Corey to run on the treadmill as punishment, which was captured on video. Judge Ryan expressed profound sorrow for the loss of such a young life, saying that Gregor's actions were cruel beyond comprehension and that the court had no choice but to impose a severe sentence to reflect the gravity of the crime. So Gregor was essentially sentenced to 20 years for aggravated manslaughter and an additional 5 years for endangering the welfare of a child. Now, under New Jersey's No Early Release Act, he's got to serve 85% of the sentence before he will be eligible for parole, particularly in this case because of that shocking footage from the video of him on the treadmill. One of the things that is really sad is that Corey's mother, Brianna Michelow, made so many efforts to report the abuse. The fact that, as I said at the very beginning, over an 18-month period, she put in 100 calls to the New Jersey Department of Child Protection and she was absolutely ignored. There were multiple injuries, bruises, black eyes, a bite mark, etc. They had lots of reasons to remove this child and they didn't. Despite all of those reports, DCPP only opened 7 formal investigations. 7! And carried on letting this child, who was clearly being abused, be placed in his father's care, where the abuse escalated, as it so often does in these cases. He was basically given carte blanche to abuse his child. And like I said, she constantly asked for help. She constantly wanted support in getting custody, most notably in March 2021, most notably when she said that she was scared that he was in real danger, and still all of her requests were denied by the court. They didn't find sufficient evidence of imminent or irreparable harm to justify removing him. But this was literally just hours, essentially, before he died. Just hours. Let that sink in. Just hours. It's unbelievable to me. It's unbelievable that this mother was pleading for help and was so correct in her assumption that her child was in danger. And in spite of those pleas, they fell on deaf ears, and now we're dealing with the death of a child. An absolutely unnecessary death. Will there be another report that comes out with the same statements? Lessons will be learned, when ultimately they never are. This video is 100% dedicated to Corey. Gorgeous little boy. All he wanted to do was make his daddy proud, and for that, he lost his life. Let me know your thoughts on this, guys. I'll see you again next time.